Good afternoon. Welcome to Urban Anabaptist Families Workshop. And can you hear me? Is it coming through? Okay, sort of. I'll stand closer. There you go. We would like to share some stories about our family and about raising families in a city. And I'm just going to give you a brief introduction to our family using this photo. There's Reuben. I'm Patty. And then Holly is our oldest, and Heather, and then Kendrick, and Benjamin, and Jamie. And what we're going to do here is we're each going to speak for about 5-ish minutes, and then so if we talk fast, the reason is because we have to share the time. But we do want to leave some time at the end for a Q&A session. So we want to make sure you have enough time to ask questions, so be thinking about that. And if you would like to hear more about some of the stories that we're talking about, well, jot that down so you can ask us. And also at the end, then we'll have our boys come up. So if you think of any questions that you'd like to ask them, that would be great as well. So for 17 years, our family has been city dwellers, so much so that we feel differently and think differently than our rural counterparts. City living is part of our DNA. How did this happen? Well, in 2007, on our 5th anniversary, Reuben and I moved to Baltimore. We had 2 little girls, which you can see in the picture. Some of you, like many of our friends and relatives, may have questions about raising a family in the city, such as, is the city a safe place to take your family? Will they have any friends? Will they be negatively influenced? Will they lose their Mennonite beliefs? Will your kids have anything to do in the city? Well, we're here today to answer some of those questions. So when we first started looking for a house in Baltimore, one of the things that was important to us that it would have a backyard of some sort, even if it was small. And we did find one. God blessed us with this house and yard. When we moved there, it was filled with bamboo, but we cut it down because we wanted space for our children to play and to invite friends over, and which we did. But having a small city space forces you to use public areas and common areas such as parks. We went to the park a lot, especially when I was at home. Reuben was teaching school at the public school, and I had 2 little children, and I babysat another one and soon had another baby. But we went to parks a lot to meet other people and spend time there. Babies, by the way, are a natural conversation starter, so never fear. If you have a baby, you'll be able to talk with people. I made a lot of connections with other moms and invited them to my house. And then we soon began a play group. They'd come to my house, and they'd invite us to their house, and every week we'd just get together and hang out and play. About the second year, I was homeschooling kindergartner, so it turned into a little homeschool group because some of them were also homeschooling. Oh, here's a picture of our play groups. I don't know if you can see this very well, but the second one here is in another home when they had us over to their house. On our street, on the first year that we lived there, the very first summer, there was a terrible thunderstorm. It brought down trees, and the electricity was out, and there were 2 older widow ladies who lived just 4 houses down, and we hadn't met them yet. This was the first time. We came home with our 2 little girls in the middle of this rainstorm with the electricity off, and they were wondering how we would survive with 2 children without electricity. And so they were kind enough to tell us to come, and they gave us a lantern, a battery-operated lantern. And ever after that, they adopted us as their grandchildren, so they became our grandparents to our children. They came over a lot. We left our children go there to play. They babysat for us, and they always showered us with presence and love. Speaking of babies, our the first year we lived there, Our first son was born. It was a complicated pregnancy. And one night, in the middle of the night, we needed to go to the hospital fast. And we had one vehicle. And wouldn't you know, when we got to the end of our street, we had a flat tire. And as we had left the house, Reuben had seen our neighbor man come home. It was 2 a.m. in the morning, and he had come home from work. And so we knew he was awake, and we went and knocked on his door, and Reuben just said, "We need a vehicle. Could we borrow yours?" And he didn't even answer. He just handed the keys over, and we took his car to the hospital and brought it back the next day. That day, we were planning to have a home birth, and so I ended up needing to be transported by ambulance to the hospital, which was not very far away, but an ambulance on your street always caused some excitement. And so neighbors were lining the street. They were looking, standing on their porches, watching as they carried me out on a stretcher. And it was all good, because in that short year, we had met a lot of them and knew them, but they were all very concerned for us. And when we came back home with this little boy, they were quick to shower us with presents. They came by and brought presents for us, for everyone. I have another story, but I'm going to hold that in case we run out of time here. But if you want to hear the story about one of our sons who wandered away from home and was found by strangers, you can ask that in the Q&A session.
So as we were preparing for this topic, we were mostly trying to think about what's it like to raise a family in the city. So again, we're telling many stories about that, and we want to give because of some feedback we've gotten, we thought it might be helpful to give you an opportunity to ask questions. Again, Patty talked about that. So if you don't ask questions, that we have lots more stories to tell. But again, we want to give you a chance to maybe hear some things. How many of you live in the city? Nice. So the one thing that really encourages me is that there's more and more people who are willing to live in the city. I was actually going to ask if any of you are kind of scared to live in the city. Any hands there? But that would be maybe people who aren't living in the city yet. It's definitely a different way of living, right? And that's part of what we're talking about here today. One of the significant benefits of living in the city and raising a family is having frank conversations with our children. And we got the opportunity to have conversations with our children that I don't think we would have had if we would have lived in suburbia. I think you can have them there, but the opportunity isn't quite as clear and present. So there was a picture earlier, Patty talked about our neighbors that kind of adopted us. Well, they were Christians, but they wore pants. What do you do with that? So, this is a picture of another friend, and she was a Christian too, and she wore pants. And again, this is, it depends what your perspective is on this, but my children knew that, when we grew up, they grew up in pretty much Mennonite circles, and so we kind of had this idea that Christians, wear dresses. That's what Christian ladies do. And so then we started to get to know people there in Baltimore that they were Christian ladies, and they didn't wear dresses. Like, what do you do with that? And so we had the opportunity to explain to our daughters, because they were the ones that were the first to ask about that. I had the opportunity to explain to them that life is a little bit more gray than that. It's not just black and white. And so again, the frank conversations was one of the things that one of the benefits to raising children in the city. Another place where I got to have a frank conversation with two people, and both of them would not really Christian. They, knowledge of Christianity, but wouldn't really claim to be Christians themselves. Every Christmas, we typically send a letter to friends and neighbors and so on. And one of the things that we put in our Christmas letter was that two of our children had accepted Christ. And so got to have a conversation with our next door neighbor. And at that point, we helped to start a school and daycare. I had also had a parent at the daycare wondering, so what does that mean? And so God had the opportunity to have a conversation with somebody who was, genuinely curious. What is that? What happens? What is that? And so got to explain to them what it means to become a Christian. And one of those same people, her name was Elaine. This was a couple weeks before Easter, and she was wondering, so how do Mennonites celebrate Easter? And so I talked a little bit about some of the things we value during that time of year. And she was kind of, so the way the discussion went was that, lots of churches have Easter egg hunts and things like that. And she's like, what does that have to do with Easter, really? Okay, but so I think some churches do that as a way to engage the community, and there's that's appropriate. But her point was that that's not the point of Easter egg hunts. That's not the point. Even though she was coming from really a secular perspective, but just making an observation about how Christians work and live. But yeah, she was expressing appreciation for how we looked at Easter. Anyway, so some of the frank conversations that we got to have with people. So most of our life in the city was, just like everybody's life. It was just simply about living life, going for groceries, changing diapers, whatever normally happens, going to work. So we're picking out a few stories from our experience there that are kind of have some rich meaning to them. So those didn't happen every day, right? But again, we're trying to give you a snapshot of some of the. We'll probably talk about more good than bad, but some of the good and bad about raising a family in the city. So one of the greatest challenges to raising a family in the city is the challenge of space. So, yeah, I'll get to this picture in a bit. The space constraints. So, Kevin this morning in his topic mentioned playing sports in an 8x30 basement. Well, that's a very small space, right? But I can very much identify with that. We have, I think my next picture shows this a little bit. So we also had a small backyard. We lived in about 1/8 of an acre. So not much space, but if you don't have a lot of, if you don't have a lot of two-dimensional space, like width and length, then you can go three-dimensional. So, all right. So I don't know. This doesn't show up real well in the picture, but back here we had what we call an Amish wash line. One of those that you can make your wash go out towards the backyard. Yeah, that. So a couple people know what I'm talking about. Well, the other thing that when we put that big post up there in our backyard, buried at 5 foot in the ground, when we put that up, we also put up a zip line. Yeah, see, small space, you just go up a little higher. So we found lots of ways to use our space creatively. The other thing that, again, Kevin mentioned this, and Patty mentioned as well, one of the things that we enjoyed in the city is going to parks. Because it was one of the places that we could go and enjoy more yard space. And the thing that I always like to tell my children is that, we don't even have to take care of it, right? Somebody else takes care of it, so we just go use it. And sometimes we would go driving through the country and they'd see these nice big yards, like, wow, they have a lot of space. But then I would quickly remind them, you realize how long it takes them to mow that grass? And we don't have to do that. Anyway, so we enjoyed using the public space that was available. The other thing that we did in our backyard is we raised chickens. Yeah. We didn't have any trees in our backyard. Actually, we had trees, but they ended up needed to be cut down because they were in bad shape. So the best we could do is we built this structure, which I kind of think eventually was our chickens were incorporated into that, but that was our tree house. And we kind of our children wanted a tree house. That was the best we could do. Ice cream, we also often had our neighbors over, especially in the summertime, for ice cream. And one of the reasons that we did that is we had tried, it was, again, we wanted connection points with our neighbors. And so we tried to have them over for a meal, but we just couldn't get many people to commit to that. So it felt like it was apparently too big of a commitment or felt too significant. But what we found is they were quite happy to come over for ice cream. And so in the summertime, we had a electric ice cream maker, so we would make ice cream and had neighbors over for that. And that tended to work very well. So one of the things we discovered with that is you have to figure out what works for the people that you're living with. And that seemed to be a little less intimidating, apparently, and so it was easier for them to come over for that. Yeah, I have to show. So those of you that know me know that so we first converted a bus in Baltimore City, and so most of that work was done sitting right outside our house. We didn't have a driveway to pull the bus into, so it was parked along the sidewalk and really kind of irritated some of my neighbors. But so I usually didn't have the bus there for more than a couple hours in the evening when we were working on it, and then I had other places that I could park it that we knew could safely park it that wasn't right in front of the house. Because, again, we wanted to respect our neighbor's space. But my point in talking about that, there is some things you can do in the city. Even now where we live in Williamsport, we do have a parking pad, and my bus just so fits in there. There's about a 3-foot drop there that my family is always worried that I'm going to drive the bus into the garden. Haven't yet. I've gotten really close, but hasn't yet fallen into the garden. But again, use of space. My son is currently working on building a shed, which he started building inside the garage, which is just on the side here. The other day, we currently have it out in the parking pad, and we need it. It's not much of a parking pad, so sometimes we need to move it. So it's sitting on wheels. The other day, we came home from school, and the thing was out that we had like high winds. It's spring, right? Kind of windy, and the thing was just blowing around. Like, are you serious? And it landed out in the alleyway behind our garage. So anyway, we ended up spending about an hour and a half getting the thing back in. But my point is use of space. So he's building a shed on our 1/8 of an acre that he's planning to sell. So there's ways to creatively use space. One more story. And this is one of the more negative sides. So our children grew up in a setting where they were used to seeing, like when we would walk to school, walk around the community, they would see drug deals happening, people cussing at each other. That was just part of what they grew up with. And they kind of just walked past it and didn't really even notice it that much. It was just part of normal life. And part of the reason I tell this story is one of my girls is going to talk about this a little bit more, or something similar to this. But one day I got to school, and this is about half an hour before the school opened for the day, and there's a guy just laying there on the sidewalk, just wiped out on drugs, something, I don't know what. But he's just asleep on the sidewalk. And there was a police there, so I went in because I had to take care of some stuff inside the building. Came out about 15 minutes later, the guy's gone, the police officer's still there, and I'm like, okay, so what did you do with the dude? And he's like, well, we got him up and got him moving. Really, are you serious? Like, that's it? It's like, 'cause again, you didn't take him, he wasn't incarcerated, he wasn't locked up. No, we just got him moving, and he's, but again, that's part of the reality. That's, there's enough of that happens that, they can't incarcerate all those people. And so he got him moving and moved on to the next thing. All right, I'm going to turn it over to Heather. She's going to talk next.
All right, I'm going to share the perspective of a child growing up in the city. Personally, city life is all I've ever known. We moved when I was 2, so I don't remember living in the country at all. City life is in my DNA, like my mom said. A lot of people wonder if I was lonely growing up in the city. There's no Mennonite kids to play with. What are you going to do? Many of my friends were from different races, backgrounds, cultures, religions, etc. 2 of my best friends, wrong way. There we go. 2 of my best friends were actually lived a few blocks away from us. One of them was Shannon. Her family was not Christian. They were atheists. The other one was Ivy. She lived across the street. They were nominally Christian. They would have gone to church on Easter. But they were some of my best friends growing up. I have a lot of fond memories of playing with dolls at their houses. Back then, I didn't know what religion they affiliated with, and it didn't matter to me. What mattered was I felt safe and happy at their homes, and they were my friends. So didn't being friends with these people make you become like them? Didn't I wonder about atheism? Didn't I want to believe the same things as them? No, that's not what happens to children who live in the city. The peer pressure doesn't typically affect them like that. If you grow up in the city, you learn to know why you believe what you believe. I would go home and ask my parents questions about their beliefs, and I became more sure of what I believed because of my childhood in the city. One of my first stories, so I felt very safe and happy as a child in the city. Like my dad said, I wasn't aware of the danger going on around me. I wasn't aware of the drug deals, the crime. But the first time I remember encountering perceived danger was when I was about 3 years old. My neighbors had a very friendly pit bull, who my sister and I, they lived in the house next door, and their dog would go out in the yard and play. And my sister and I loved to run up and down beside the yard and tease him and talk to him. And one day, the dog somehow got out of the yard. My dad was behind the shed working on something, and my mom was inside the house, and we were terrified. In my dad's words, we screamed bloody murder. After we had been screaming for a few seconds, my dad came running, and not only did he come running, but a few neighbors came running as well. They were very concerned for us. Screams will get you attention in the city. 2 things I learned from this experience: don't scream just for fun. People will come running. Also, if you are in trouble, screaming will get you help. There are always people who will come running to help you. It can be strangers, people you know, they will come and help. Apparently I wasn't too traumatized by this because today I work in an animal hospital, so yeah. So there is no real danger in this story, but the city can be a dangerous place. Baltimore has one of the highest crime rates in America, and there are a lot of broken and hurting people in Baltimore. There is spiritual darkness, poverty, and violence. For this reason, my parents were very intentional about teaching city safety to us as children. I learned things like learning to be aware of my surroundings. I learned who to ask for help if I felt in danger. I learned that you can't walk barefoot off of our property because there are drug needles, there are feces, whether they be human or animal feces. I learned to lock doors before you go to bed. Even today, when I'm downstairs last, I know to lock the doors. It's just muscle memory at this point. You always need to hide your valuables when you leave the car. You can't leave a wallet or a phone sitting out. I learned to stay in well-lit places. There is safety in numbers, so always stay with the crowd. Something that was confusing to me as a child was there was a lot of Mennonite groups that came to volunteer, work, sing, etc. And they were very helpful, and I enjoyed having them come. I got to follow my dad around when he gave them tours around the city. But they were always a little mystifying to me. They seemed so much older and wiser than I was, but at the same time, they did some very confusing things. I didn't understand their culture, and they didn't understand mine. They walked 3 or 4 people wide on the sidewalks, which was confusing to me because I knew you have to walk too wide because we share space with everybody. So to combat this, my dad invented the pedestrian police. If you live in the city, you know this is not a thing. So the pedestrian police are in essence a police force that polices people walking on the sidewalks. If you walk more than 2 wide, you will be arrested. A lot of people believed this. People that visited would say derogatory things about people that didn't look like them. This comes from a place of being afraid of something different than you. They didn't understand different people. And this was hurtful to me because a lot of my friends looked different than me, and they were saying derogatory things about people like this. They were not very good at crossing streets, which is another thing that I just learned from a young age. And yeah, but I'm sure they did come with good intentions, and I did learn more about Mennonite culture through these groups. My parents always knew the parents of the kids' houses we went to, which is another safety thing. It's very important to know where your kids are going. I got to take an art class when I was in 4th grade at a local college, and at this point, my parents let me use a phone to take with me just for safety reasons. We stayed relatively safe when we lived in the city. We were never robbed or anything like that. But one time, at least not seriously robbed, one time, my sister and I had some friends over for a sleepover in our converted bus. And someone broke into our van that night. So our bus was parked on the street a few blocks away. And we learned that in the morning, and there's cops that knocked on our door, and they told us that someone had broken into our van. But we were safe. Nothing ever happened to us. Today, living in Williamsport, I have some friends from the country who are not allowed to visit Williamsport, who are not allowed to come there for a sleepover because they will get stabbed. I let them know, I've been stabbed so many times, it's very dangerous, don't come. The danger shouldn't scare us, though. It is dangerous, yes, but Jesus went to many dangerous places. He spent time with people others would not spend time with. If God wants you in the city, he's going to protect you and your children. So in conclusion, the city can be a very dangerous place, but there are a lot of good people there who will look out for you whether they know you or not. I wouldn't have wanted to grow up anywhere else. This city is in my DNA now, and I always felt safe and loved as a child. I got to learn a lot of cool things. I learned about diversity. I learned how to be independent. I learned to know what I believe. I got to see hurting people, and through that, I grew a passion for building the kingdom. And I also got to develop a bigger world picture than if I had grown up in the country. Oh, my sister Holly is going to talk now about a few more stories.
Okay, so I am Holly. I'm the oldest. I moved there when I was 2. Heather was 1, not 2. So we're not twins, as many people think. And there's a group picture of one of the groups that came to Baltimore at one point. I'll say this first. Being raised in the city was one of the best things that my parents did for me. I couldn't imagine life any different and wouldn't want it any different. It shaped so much of who I am as a person, just like they were saying. And I don't want to raise my kids anywhere else other than a city. It's given me so many things. One, we're TCKs, so if you don't know, that's short for third culture kids, which means that we were raised in one culture by parents from a different culture, and it makes us kind of a mixture of all the cultures. It means that we're able to relate to both cultures, but not really fit in either place because we're a little bit different in both places. So I kind of think of a TCK as a cultural bridge. So we're talking about bridges. Being a bridge is not easy. It's not easy bridging 2 cultures. It's definitely not easy being a TCK all the time, but it is very rewarding and necessary. You will get the best of both worlds, both of your cultures. Being raised in the city, we're more culturally aware. We grew up among so many cultures. Most of my friends were not Mennonite and maybe not even Christians, and they were from all sorts of different cultures. But that didn't stop us from being friends. When I saw groups and people coming and looking down at people that were my friends or were people that could have been my friends, it was really confusing to me, and still is when people speak derogatorily about people that are my friends or look like my friends. So here's a few pictures of my friends. This is my best friend from school and her sister, my sister. Over there is our 2 neighbor girls and us sitting outside. And then there's a picture of a random girl that I met at a park one day. We were besties for like a couple hours, and she wanted a picture, so I took a picture of her. And there is, on the right, is my friend Holly. We met at the Walters Art Museum at a program for kids. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. We found out we have the same name, and we're still friends to this day. And then there on the bottom is a girl that came a couple times with a group, and we would be besties for a day, and then she would leave again. I have no idea where she's at today. So I also saw firsthand how to share the gospel and how to live it and how to live with openness. At a very early age, I learned why we believe what we believe, going back to the frank conversations about Christians with pants, things like that. I learned, to have a conviction about what I believe. I also think a lot of times people think that they're scared of losing their faith or their kids leaving God, but it's the kind of the opposite when you grow up beside it. I always knew that we were different and that our standards were different, and that was the way it is, and that's okay. So they might not believe in the same thing as we do. They might believe in it, but they carry it out a different way. But that's just the way, that's just perfectly fine. Like, we're different. So, and I don't feel threatened when I go to like a non-Mennonite church, for example. I don't feel like I'm gonna drop all my beliefs just because they believe differently, which is something I've kind of picked up from the Mennonites that we're around now. Also, peer pressure, like my sister said, isn't really a thing. They wouldn't really expect you to look like them. Like, everyone looks different in the city. Now, if I can simplify, I feel like there's kind of two different ways to raise kids in the city. You can raise them at home. You can keep them at home. You can raise them with your own expectations and subcultural values. You can not really involve them in things and, just raise them yourself. Or you can involve them in the culture and the ministry and the community, get them out, take them to parks, things like that. We were raised as the last. We did lots of things from play dates to parks. We played with neighbor kids, went to their houses, went to library programs and museums and school activities or after school activities and play group. So there we took violin lessons for a while, and we were in a group called the Charles Street Fiddlers that our teacher did, and that's right there. So we got to play violin in the middle of the street at a festival. There is a program that we went to and a birthday party. So we were never bored, which a lot of people ask what we do in the city. Like, what do you do? And I'm always confused by that because what don't you do? There's always something to do in the city. You will never get bored. And my mom didn't tell this story then, but going back to the story of one of my brothers running away, I never felt unsafe in the city. I knew that if I was in danger and if I needed help, I could always go knock on one of my neighbors' doors and they would let me in and keep me safe. I started babysitting when I was 9 or 10, and I would walk places by myself. I would walk to the babysitting houses. I would walk home from school by myself at a fairly young age, I guess. And I would pass people like the teachers or other Mennonites, and they would be so shocked to see me walking by myself when I didn't even think twice about it, and it was just completely normal. I was like, yeah, why would you be surprised by seeing me walking by myself? Let me see. I think one of the best things you can do for your kids is to raise them in the city or on the mission field. I might be biased, but if you do decide to raise your kids in the city, both you and they will be tremendously blessed, and they will be amazing people. I was very excited about doing this because it's something I'm very passionate about and hope for other people. So I guess that's the time for questioning now.
All right, so you boys can come up and fill out the rest of our chairs here. Do you have questions? Again, if you don't, we have more stories to tell, but we're happy to talk about some questions that you have.
Why did you leave Baltimore and move to Williamsburg? Was that difficult?
Those are two kind of different questions. I'll start talking about the why, and then maybe Patty, you can talk about how difficult it was. So I'll give you this, and you can start thinking about that. So the main reason that we left, the school and daycare that we were a part of there in Baltimore, our goal there was always to start more than one location. So we moved to Williamsport to help get a second location started. So that was our main purpose in doing that. So I'm currently not involved in Urban Mennonite Ministries, the organization we were part of then, but yeah, that was our main reason for moving to another city.
So was it difficult? It was exciting to be moving on because we are adventurers and we had been talking about this for quite a while. However, cities are very different, and I think we only realized after we left Baltimore and moved to what we call a podunk town, that really our hearts are in the big city, and Williamsport is a city, but it doesn't have the opportunities that we enjoyed in Baltimore. Plus, it's just a very different cultural feel. But yeah, so was it hard? I don't know. Does anybody else want to speak to that?
I think the hard.
Can I actually say one thing? So, and just the two cities in comparison. So Baltimore City is about 600,000 people. Williamsport is about 30,000. So definitely a significant difference as far as culture and just the reality.
I think the hardest part for me was probably, so we go to Mennonite school now, and it's just a completely different culture than the city is, than urban people are. So it was just very much of a culture shock to me moving to a Mennonite area. So I think that was probably the hardest part for me, adjusting to their culture.
Other questions?
So as far as the school in Baltimore, what was that school, you all were, was that a mission school that the children went to, or?
Yes, it would have been, which actually could be a whole nother topic, but like, so the school was started as an evangelistic opportunity or as a mission school. So we didn't require there to be a certain number of Mennonite families. There were always some Mennonite families connected with the school, but it was open to people from the community. And you didn't have to be Christian to be part of the school. Is there more to your question?
So was there a Mennonite community around you at all in the city, or were you pretty much alone?
Yeah, good question. So do you want to address that? So yeah, maybe talk about how the Mennonite community got started.
Yeah, when we were planning to move there, our intention was to move with a team. However, we ended up going there on our own for 2 years. I think we were there for 2 years before another family joined us, and then it kind of grew from there. So he taught school in a public school for 4 years before we started the mission school. Once we started the school, then teachers were moving in, and it grew from there.
What are the boys' favorite things to do in the city or in general? No matter which one. What are
So,
their favorite things to do?
Good question, because often the quandary is, okay, so we have boys, like how are we going to keep them busy, right? That's often the quandary. We haven't found that to be a real problem, but yeah.
So back in Baltimore, there was like right across the school we had a park, and there was a skate park there. So like you don't really have that in the country, and it was always great to go over there, have fun there.
We also invited friends over. We had fun with that. We played with them.
We had a wild berry park nearby. It had like wild berries near it, and we had fun picking berries there. And yeah, I just really enjoyed that. And then there would be other people that would be at that park, so we had fun there.
All right, so I think that provides a good segue for the story you should tell.
So I have to tell you the story because he's the one who walked away from home. Not
More than
once,
once.
not twice, I'm sorry, but 4 times before he was 4 years old. The first time when he was 18 months, we were just like, we had to park on the street because we didn't have a parking pad or anything. So I had 5 little ones. And to unload everybody, and all the groceries and everything to get up into the house is a job. But he was the last little one. I put him in front of our steps and said, go up the steps. And we got everybody else up, and we're like, okay, where's Jamie? And we couldn't find him. Went out and looked up and down the street, and there he was down the sidewalk a little bit. And an old man was just standing there. He said, I was just going to stand here and talk to this little boy until somebody comes for him. But then when he was 2, he decided he was going to go to the Mulberry Park because that was his favorite thing to do, and it was spring. And I said, yeah, we'll have to do that sometime. And he took that and as permission to go. And I didn't even think about it until somebody knocked on the door, and there was these strange people and Jamie. And I went, and I'm sure my eyes were big, and they're like, do you know this little boy? I'm like, yeah. They said, well, he was over at the park, and he showed me, no, I don't know if he didn't make it the whole way there. He was ready to cross the last street. He would have had to cross 1, 2, I think the 3rd street. And he was standing there at the crosswalk waiting till there was no traffic. And a car decided to stop because they saw this little boy without any adult. And they got out of their car and they walked him back home. Then he showed him the way. But.
So one of the points of that story is that one of the things, and our daughters talked about this a little bit, one of the things that's really encouraging about that is even for people who aren't Christians, they're willing to help out. And so in many ways, there is a community there that cares about you. Again, it's different than our church communities. It's very different. But there's still a piece there where people care about each other and they care about keeping each other safe, which is really significant. So some of those values they're going to have for a different reason than we do, but they may still have some of those values which are similar to ours. Right.
As a father, as a family, how do you evaluate, like, this is an important skill that I should put in my child? If they were living on a farm, they would get this, but I don't really feel that's necessary for them. Does that make sense?
I think it does. So you might have more. There's a couple answers that I'm thinking of. So then maybe you can add some more to it. So one of the things that we cared about moving into another culture was we wanted to be able to interact well with that culture. So I'm not directly answering your question here initially, but we knew that our children were not going to have the same kind of growing up experiences that we had. So another way of looking at that same thing is we certainly valued when we were working at the school, we certainly valued people who came there, who had some initiative, who had some drive to work, some ability to work, and we wanted to make sure that our children had that. So I would say, I'm kind of working out my answer for you here as I'm talking. There's the danger in asking questions or letting people ask questions. But so a big thing for us was to care about our neighbors, to care about what they cared about, and even live life the way they lived life. Like they cared a lot about shopping locally, so we spent a lot of time shopping at the local hardware store rather than driving 20 minutes away to Lowe's. I went there sometimes too, but so that was part of the values that we instilled in them. So again, part of the connection was finding things that mattered to them, made sense to them, but we also wanted to provide them opportunities to be responsible. So one of my boys mows yard now. So and actually one of my daughters talked about babysitting. Both of them would have done some babysitting. So we tried at a fairly young age to get them to work somewhere, to be finding those opportunities where they can practice or build some skills. So no, definitely not the same as living in a rural or suburban setting, not the same set of experiences. And sometimes, like my oldest son is turning 16 this summer, and we've been working at trying to find a job for him to do this summer. So I do construction work over the summer, so usually my children can work for me. But what we're finding is that sometimes it's just difficult to find a job. So he's been to probably at least a dozen places. It's probably maybe more than that, to find something. So again, sometimes if you're in a Mennonite community, it can be much easier to find those connections, especially when you're younger, because there's just legal requirements along with that. Do you have more to add to that?
Yeah, so let me just say that you'll never be able to experience everything there is to experience. So it is a trade-off. So Heather always asked for a horse. And we just told her, look, I'm sorry, that's one experience you're not going to get in this family at this time. Maybe when you're grown up, you can have a farm. But even if we lived in the country, we weren't going to have a horse. So, sorry. The other thing is Kendrick would like to have a four-wheeler. That's going to be one of his childhood wishes that he'll never get fulfilled. But sorry. and there's things that, it's okay because they can, in their adulthood, they can follow some of those dreams if they want. But I'm going to give this to Kendrick so he can talk about some of he has watched his father build things from toddlerhood, and he would take his little plastic tools and pretend he was fixing things, and that's a skill that he learned even in the city.
So yeah, there's definitely stuff you can do in the city. Like we would go hunting and bring back deer and just put it in the garage and just butcher it there. So you just have to figure out a way to do it, kind of. And then like when I was a kid, probably about 10, like we would go around the neighborhood and rake leaves for people, do stuff like that. And yeah, it's just, you have to just do it a little differently, but you can still make it work.
I also say, she said horses, like there's, even if, it's probably not the same, but even if you can't have your own horse, there's always the option of like horseback riding, like lessons. Like you can always go experience someone else's, like go to a farm and take lessons, or go to the park and run around there. Also, we had a garden, so like you can get gardening and farming in your own backyard.
I was going to say something along the lines of what she was saying. Yeah, I did consider doing horseback lessons. I just didn't decide to then. So there's options like that. And then community gardens, we had a garden. Yeah, there's just different things like that where even though you can't have it on your property, like he was talking about earlier, there are a lot of community options where it's a public opportunity for everybody. So,
How many of you have an urban garden? So one of the really cool things about it, it depends what you define as urban garden, right? So there's two really cool things we realize. If you take all the space in your garden and you put stuff that you want to grow there, there's no space for weeds. Brilliant.
You don't have to mow grass.
That too. The other thing that we found is that we had chain link on the one side of our property, and we realized that you can grow all kinds of stuff. Again, 3-dimensional. Yeah, you can grow all kinds of stuff in those fences. We didn't do this, but our neighbors actually, they started doing the same thing. So they were actually growing pumpkins that on the chain link. And I was like, wait, that's not, how is that going to work? But actually, so they grew a fairly nice sized pumpkin, and the stem just simply grew big enough that it supported the pumpkin there hanging off the fence. Weird. Does that answer your question? Somebody else.
How much did you concern yourself with the whole Sandusky, all that in the back of your mind, and child abuse, that type of mind?
So flesh that out for me a little bit more, like in connection with what others were looking at, like
Your own children in that setting,
so interacting with other people.
yes, and then also having those other children in your own.
That's a good question. So one of the things that we very quickly realized, so we lived in a middle class community. One of the things that we very quickly realized is that I think my daughters did talk about the fact that they would go to a friend's house, but almost always, like I would say 95% of the time, but almost always, they were with a parent. So if we were going over to, if she talked about going to a friend's house, usually, if I was at work, so Patty was going along. So usually it was almost never that they went just to that child's house by themselves.
Eventually they did.
As-
You always need a parent. They were family friends by then.
Right. And so often, so again, early on what we discovered is that the parents were often present. And so even like if the children are out riding the bikes on the sidewalk, the parents are right there. we quickly learned that if our children were out on the sidewalk or out somewhere without us being very close by, the neighbors got really worried really quickly. And like they're all standing at their doors watching and just trying to figure out if they should call the police or not because they want to make sure nothing happens to the children. And again, it's not really a bad thing. But it was more, so we were very careful about learning to know the parents before we allowed them to spend time in those homes.
I would say too, it gave opportunity for one of those frank conversations. Very early on, we'd have conversations with our children about safety and privacy and what's appropriate, what to report to parents, and made sure that we checked in with them and educate ourselves on the signs of abuse, just so that we could catch things if they happen.
But yeah, that would be another example of where we were very, where we had those frank conversations with our children about, because not knowing what might happen. Because, and again, this can happen in Mennonite homes, but, it may be more likely to in other homes. But, having conversations about with them about respecting their space and knowing, when that's invaded or when that's not being used appropriately. So again, those were conversations that we had with them at an early age. Does that answer your question? Yep. Other questions?
What about, so you said at one point that most times one of you was alone if they went to a friend's house, but then later not so much. What about TV, movies?
Yes. Yes.
And that influence from those kids, interacting with your children. How did you feel on that?
Yeah. You ready to answer that? I am if you're not, but go. You want to go ahead?
So he mentioned that these are middle-class people, that we lived in a middle-class neighborhood. Ironically, they share a lot of our values for different reasons. So many of them, if they had a TV at all, didn't have it on constantly.
Or almost at all.
They were very cautious too with their children.
So again, I forget where I said this earlier, but so in some ways they were practicing the same thing as us for different reasons. Wasn't from a Christian perspective. It was more from a philosophical perspective, I guess. But yeah, they weren't sitting their children in front of a screen or didn't have the television on. So that actually really came as a surprise to us. And so some of that is going to depend on the culture that you're in. But being in a middle class community, there were some of those things that really surprised us. The other thing too that was surprising. Pretty much all of the families that we knew on our street were two-parent families. So again, depending on the kind of community you're working in, that is not the case. The community that I taught in, which was a community of high poverty, there was a lot of broken homes. And again, a lot of times we think of city, that's what we think of, but that's not true of all parts of the city. There was one family that later there was a divorce in there, so there was only a single parent. But most of them would have been from a two-parent family. So there was a number of dynamics that they would have had similar values, even if it was not from a Christian perspective. And some of those things came to us as a surprise. Okay, it looks like we have 5 minutes yet. Any other questions?
So would you feel it would be accurate to say that middle class and low class don't cross cultures much in the city?
I think there's some places in which that happens where middle class and lower class do interact with each other, but for the most part, they don't interact well. It's kind of like we often think about races don't interact a lot, and there's some of that obviously does happen. But in our experience there in Baltimore, there were some people of different races that were in our middle class community, and there was actually really no divide among the races because we were middle class, and in some ways, It does end up being difficult for them to interact with each other, partly because there's just a number of different worldview ideas that people have. So I have one more story. Does any of you have a story you want to tell yet? Anything you want to say? I have one that I would like to tell yet. I have lots more stories I'd like to tell, but I'll keep it short. So one of the things that I talked about a little bit was respecting culture. So thinking about respecting the culture of the group of people that you're living alongside of. Patty mentioned this a little bit, I mentioned as well. So we didn't have a driveway in Baltimore, so we couldn't pull our bus off to the side or our car. But they had a certain idea about how you park your cars. And space was at a premium there. Like if you came home after 7 o'clock in the evening, you probably weren't going to find a space very close to your house. So their philosophy was that you didn't try to park in front of your house, like you would maybe park another house down further, but you park up against the next car, so we don't have a bunch of empty spaces on the street, right? So it's about logic. It's not about parking in front of. There was a few people who liked to park in front of their houses, but for the most part, they were like, yeah, you just park up against the next car so we can fit more cars in. Makes a lot of sense. However, I live in a different city now. There's a very different philosophy. And yeah, speaking of frank conversations, we've had some frank and not so nice conversations. Hopefully not from my perspective, but just in general, some rather not so nice conversations about parking. And you do not park in front of somebody else's house. Period. Okay? And so I say that to say it's a simple way to respect the culture of the people you're living alongside. I don't really buy into it but again, in living there in Williamsport, people care about having their parking space and don't mess with it. And so we try to respect that. So it's a simple way in which we can respect the culture that we're living in, right? Doesn't cost us a whole lot. We grumble about it, about dealing with the system that they have, but we try to work with it. And again, this is not a right or wrong issue at all. It can quickly become that, and people have strong feelings about it. But it's just a simple example of how we can. I don't know that that's necessarily about bridging the gap, but I would say it's about bridging, from one community to another. But it's respecting the expectations they have and the desires they have. Any final questions? I think we'll wrap up. All right, Manny, do you want to come back up or?